I get a little frustrated. Something that frustrates me lately is a lot of the LGB without the T. I get a little frustrated with that movement. And although there are great people in it, there's great people that I respect that do amazing advocacy. But I think what you're seeing is sort of a self-protection instinct from a lot of people in the LGBT community, where they're seeing the increase in the dramatics of the trans conversation. But that's also a carefully crafted narrative. Because, for example, if you look in media, if you see anything that has to do with a trans person, transgender will be the first word in that article. Even if it's irrelevant. I saw it a few days ago, like on Daily Mail. They published a story of a trans woman that did something really bad, but it had nothing to do with the crime.
Yeah, they do that.
Yeah, but because we've created such a major negative conversation around trans people, and there's also so much research to show that people consume more news that's negative than positive. There was an experiment done where a news organization ran only positive media, and they lost 2/3 of their viewership. And
That's so
so
depressing.
media,
As a recovering
right,
journalist, that's so depressing.
right. But I mean, media profits off of negativity. It's like they're like that doom and gloom is what gets people to tune in. And because of that, what you're seeing now is media taking advantage of that in a way that they can benefit and they can retain viewership and revenue. And so they're going to highlight all these negative stories about trans people. But this is also boosted by the party also being very intentional in framing trans people in a different light. And I think that what you're seeing is LGBT people become very defensive, and they see it as a way to chop off the bad apples of the community, because there's such a negative light on them. And I just think it's a horrific strategy because these people are using religious talking points. If you look at it, like calling trans people groomers or child predators, or they're indoctrinating people to being trans. But go back to the 70s. Go back to the 70s and look at Anita Bryant. She spearheaded the campaign because at the time, people really didn't have negative affiliations with gay people. They really didn't. Like, people, even if they disapproved of it, they weren't as galvanized to like go vote against them. But it wasn't until Anita Bryant spearheaded the campaign that gay people were after kids. She believed that the gay agenda was trying to become teachers. Gay men were trying to become teachers to then infiltrate children and to indoctrinate children into the homosexual lifestyle. And so now you're seeing like prominent gay people and gay people spouting evangelical talking points that 30 years ago were used against them.
So let's unpack this a little bit, because I think I totally see where you're coming from. My one thing, though, is if all trans people were like you or like Blair White, I would have no interest in any LGBT without the T. And I also don't call people I'm not on board with just calling people groomers, saying they're after kids. I don't do that lightly. I don't do that almost ever. At the same time, though, I will say part of this does seem to be ammunition that extreme voices within the trans community have handed to conservatives. Because I play TikTok
absolutely.
after TikTok after TikTok on this show sometimes, where a trans activist is singing to 3-year-olds about they them pronouns, or teachers talking about how they have non-binary kindergartners in there and they encourage them. And so I don't
I completely agree.
Most trans people aren't after kids, but a sub portion of the community kind of does seem to be, and that makes it easier for people to write off the whole community.
No, I agree. And I think that one thing that we need to acknowledge, though, is that we also live in a different time in terms of social media. And social media is very rewarding to actions like that.
To crazy people.
Social media really boosts and platforms people that dive into an ideology. And that's why you see those TikToks in the first place. Like, even on my phone, like, I see non-binary all day on my phone. And I don't even look up anything related to that. And so it's social media algorithms pick it up and boost it, and it amplifies it, and people get rewarded for the more they indulge in those identities. And so I think that's honestly But I think where I don't like it is the framing that it's a trans thing. They're framing it as, oh, we don't do that, trans people do. But in reality, we live in a different time where those kind of actions are rewarded and those kind of identities. And we live in a culture now where people aren't as in community in person. They're in community online. And so it's a constant like one up of each other in terms of the identity and to build that community. And that gets boosted by social media. But if you look back even a couple decades ago, like talking about like, you talked about like teachers saying that they have non-binary kids and this and that, those kind of arguments were there in the 70s and into the 80s. They were. Like, I remember, like, I looked and I read a story talking about the reason why even that movement started, talking about the gay agenda, indoctrinating children and gay men doing that, was because these people were being shown videos of men engaging in engaging in wrong acts with children, and they were showing them examples, whether they were real or not, of gay men trying to become teachers and turning kids gay. And so those kinds of things were there, but obviously in history, they have a different perception because that's the 70s, 80s we're talking about. But if you look at it, they do mirror themselves quite a bit. But we live in a time, though, where social media boosts everything to the extreme. Everything is to the extreme. And so that's why I think sometimes we've lost a little bit of historical perspective. And that's why trans people seem so extreme. And I agree that they are. And the activism is a mess because they're advocating for trans people in the absolute wrong way. But at the same time, I think that we also do need to see that it does kind of align with the arguments used a couple decades ago. I think that what we're accrediting to being a unique trans thing, like it's just it's not gay people that did that, it's trans people. I think it has a lot to do with our social media culture at the same time.
Yeah, there was no videos and social and TikToks right. at the time, and maybe you would have seen gay teachers doing inappropriate things and going viral more often back then.
Absolutely.
I don't know. Maybe you would have.
Because that was the argument then. And so I think that it's just social media now. People have created that ammunition that, and this is not me excusing it. Like, I'm not saying that it's an excuse. But I just think that I really wish that we took the time to really digest that historical perspective of it.
That's
because
valid.
the strategy of chopping off trans people from the community will never work.
Well, it's never going to happen. So it's kind of a moot point. But I will just say, I can understand why gay people who fought so hard for acceptance and finally achieved it and are now kind of we're seeing anti-gay backlash as well. We're seeing more homophobia. We're seeing declining support for gay rights. Would look at, the most extreme examples of trans activists who are doing incredibly distasteful things, flashing their breasts at the White House, singing about they, them pronouns to toddlers and little kids, and be like, I don't want to be associated with that. I can understand that impulse, even though I do acknowledge, A, it's never going to happen, and B, that's not all trans people or even most trans people.
Right. And I think that, but I honestly genuinely think it's just a lot of hypocrisy because, I mean, look at the Senate scandal and look at the language that came up with that. Like, they're literally talking, like, you're seeing conservatives talk about sodomy.
Yeah.
They're calling people sodomites. So it's clear that, like, those and so that's what I really want gay people that are kind of trying to aim some negativity at trans people. I want them to remember the bedrock of the party is the traditional family unit and the roles associated within it. LGBT people will always differ from that. They always will. That's why now you're even seeing the conversation. Have you noticed the conversation about surrogacy?
Oh, yes. I haven't dived into this on this podcast, yes, but it's very toxic.
Look at how they're starting to talk about gay men using surrogacy. Like, so it always goes back to that value. And so I get where gay people are coming from, and they're seeing a lot of exposure of negative trans material. But at the same time, don't think that by solely condoning trans people and saying gay people have fought so hard for this and now they're doing this, in reality, there's always been a target on everybody. And that's why you're now seeing that trans people have turned so negative in the public eye, now they got their foot in the door, and you saw a lot of that discourse pop up with gay people with the Senate scandal.
Yeah.
And you're seeing the conversation about surrogacy.
Well, I've
Look at how
also
they're talking
argued that
about.
the extreme people in the gay community give us all a bad name too.
Right.
But I do
it's
kind
a
of
lot.
think,
So
though, if we were the LGB without the T thing, in my view, the ship has sailed. Like it is LGBT. It's never going to change.
right. You can give it
However, I
up.
would say in the abstract, I do think sexuality and gender identity are like different or distinct concepts.
Oh, they are. Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
I think if I was designing a different world, I'm not sure they would be like. I'm not sure it makes sense for them to be inherently linked. I agree that they now are, but I'm not sure that on the most theoretical of basis, it really does make sense because they're not the same, or they're not like bisexual, lesbian, and gay people all have something in common about their sexual orientation. Trans people is about gender identity. It just kind of seems like its own thing, and I'm not saying that makes it worse or bad. I'm just saying it makes
Uh-huh.
it different and distinct. And I don't really inherently understand the grouping other than as a necessary outcrop of the need for like civil rights and acceptance and against, a traditionalist backlash and that. I'm not sure I fully understand them as concepts that should, in theory, be grouped together.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and I agree with that partially. I think I can definitely see, because I think they have different needs, and they have different advocacy needs for sure. Trans people obviously have very different needs from LGBT people, and LGBT people advocate for different things than trans people typically do. But I think that there's too much overlap for it to fully be decategorized in the way that it is. And I think that just also goes back to history. Like, for example, like you go back to the early 1900s, and there were researchers done, and there even were clinics opened to the treatment of homosexuals, but that always included gender nonconformity. And that was always present there, and that was because a lot of the needs did overlap. And I think that more things overlap than separate them, and that's just my personal opinion. And I think that there's so much shared, and I think that it's not even just like looking at it at face value. There's so much more cultural overlap with gay and trans people. There's so much more shared experience between lesbian, gays, and bisexuals and trans people. There's so many different thought processes exchanged that are very similar. And so I think that there's just so many different aspects of it that overlap more than separate them.
I think some people who are in this kind of like right-leaning LGBT umbrella agree with you. Some people don't, and
Yeah, and that's okay.
some people come at it from a place of bad faith. Like I will say, some of the LGB without the T advocacy comes off as genuinely transphobic.
Yeah.
Some of them seem to genuinely find trans people disgusting, and I think that's really wrong and really cruel and very hypocritical. But there are some people who just don't really view them as being grouped together. I think I used to be more in that camp, and I've become a lot more sympathetic to grouping them together over the years. But I can still see where they're coming from, and I acknowledge some of them, I think, hold that belief in good faith. But I definitely do agree with you, and I've seen you spar with them on Twitter. Some of the LGBT without
Yes.
the T
Somebody
people
has to.
are pretty toxic.
Like, because like it gets to a point where they act like evangelicals, and I just don't understand how they can even comprehend talking points like that, when those talking points 40 years ago were used to try and take them down. And I think that that's just people. I think it's really just trying to save face. I think you see a lot of people where their guard goes up when they see such negative press, and they see so many negative eyes on the LGBTQ community as a whole. And so I think people want to distance themselves from what's being so negatively discussed, and what people want to eradicate, what people want to put laws in place to restrict. And so I think people want to protect themselves. And so I understand where it comes from, but I really encourage people to really look at it from a holistic point of view, and to look at it in a bigger picture, because trying to chop off LGBT people will never be a successful strategy. Going after trans people as a gay person is never going to be a successful strategy, because, like I said, The people that, because at the same time, where does that come from? That's what I challenge people. Think about where that's coming from for you. What is your objective when you try and eliminate, like they always talk about taking away the TQ. What is your objective in doing that? What will you achieve if you do that? You will achieve good grace, and you will be in good standing and good favor with most likely people on the right that are heavily criticizing them. And in reality, the same kind of things that they're using against us do go back to you. And that's why I brought up the Senate and the surrogacy conversation, because now you're seeing those first little drops of them starting to have the conversation about why gay people are also degenerate, and it's a perversion, like it's a perversive lifestyle, and why it's threatening the family.
All right, well, Brianna, we will leave it there for now.